From Washington, D.C., the swamp itself, this is the week's worst with Allen and Vadum. I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen, Vice President and Chief Investigative Officer at the Capitol Research Center.
And I'm Matthew Vadum, Senior Vice President at Capitol Research Center. I'm also Editor-in-Chief of our website, bombthrowers.com.
This is our podcast in which we dig through the news for stories that we think are the most outrageous, the most ridiculous, the worst. We do it so you don't have to. And Matthew, you start this week.
What an incredible first 2 weeks President Trump has had in the White House. My God, all the protests, all the good conservative progress, all of the venom and the riots and the craziness. I think it's wonderful. What do you think, Steve?
Well, it's interesting. People on the left see this as Trump being put down. Politico had a headline that the business with the temporary ban on people coming in from terrorist hotspots, that was Trump's first defeat, it said. And
you are, of course, referring to Executive Order 13769.
Exactly. And, I've seen polling numbers where the president's numbers are going up.
The order's still mostly in effect.
Yeah. Of course, you're always going to have some judges that are going to oppose anything this president does, and you're always going to have temporary orders against anything. But I think so far it's been very successful. He's made his point, and the rhetoric, the craziness on the other side has just escalated to the point where, man, if I were a politician, I would want to have these people as my enemies. They are so over the top. They are so crazy.
As someone I read online, someone had an awesome quip, a nice perspective on this. He said that all these crazy leftist protesters were guaranteeing President Trump a third term.
Well, they certainly will be helping him get his second term, that's for sure. Why
don't we, Steve, if you don't mind, why don't we explain what this Executive Order 13769 actually is, because not everybody listening may understand it. My understanding is it's a travel ban from Muslim-majority countries that happen to be terrorist hotspots. It's countries like Syria, which already had a refugee ban on it, Iran, Iraq, and so on. And it's part of a pause that President Trump proposed some time ago, I think on the campaign trail, to just freeze things in place with America's policies with respect to admitting aliens from those countries for, I think it's 90 days and depending on the category, 120 days. So America can rethink and get, how it does things and get a handle on what its policy should be in terms of admitting people from these dangerous regions. So that's what that is, and it's been met with immediately Trump has been labeled Hitler by the left, and it's crazy. You have Senator Tim Kaine, who was Hillary's Veep, vice presidential candidate, saying that we need to fight this in the streets, like he's a full-blown Leninist, Marxist-Leninist leader, and this just all-around nuttiness. There have been a couple of federal judges who have put injunctions in place affecting part of the order, but the order's still in effect. One of them, Ann Donnelly in Brooklyn, put in the most publicized injunction, and that preserves the status quo for aliens from those countries who already managed to make it inside the country as of the time the executive order was signed. And of course, George Soros's groups that he supports were behind that lawsuit, most prominently the American Civil Liberties Union.
Yeah, I would say this. I think there's one error in what you said, which is...
Only one?
Only one. You said Muslim-majority countries. Now, these are, in fact, Muslim-majority countries, but that's something that people are throwing in there as if that's the reason these countries were picked. It would be like referring to Europe as Christian majority, a bunch of Christian majority countries.
Well, it's not an error. You're saying it's irrelevant.
I'm saying it's the kind of meme that is an idea as a virus. It's called a meme, that people on the left like to insert into the process so that you end up talking, for example.
Oh my God, I've been brainwashed.
I know, you've been brainwashed.
Thank you for letting me know,
So
Dr.
that we talk about Hillary having a private email account instead of talking about how she stole 66,000 government documents that she didn't have a right to. So when you switch something like that, it changes the way you think about things. And so I just bring that up because that's what I keep hearing even from people on our side. They will refer to these as Muslim majority countries. I should point out, I have a list here. I have a list in my hand.
Okay. Is this part of my re-education camp?
Exactly. And I knew you were going to say that, so I prepared this list, which is where I went through. Anyone can do this. You can go on Wikipedia and you can click on a little button where it has countries by Muslim population, and you'll see that if you look at just the total number of Muslims in any given country, that the countries that are on this list are number 6, 10, 12, 17, 19, 25, and 36. If you look at the percentage, now this is a little dicey because most of them are bunched in together in the top few percent. Most of them are 97% Muslim or more. But nevertheless, the list is, if you go by percentage of Muslims in the population from each of these countries, it's the number 5 country, the number 9, 10, 11 country, the number 20 country, 21, and 37. So in other words, these weren't picked because they were the Muslim countries. They were picked because, as it turns out, the Obama administration had them on a list of terrorist hotspots that we were going to be very careful watching people when they would travel to these countries. It would affect your ability to travel into the United States.
Right, and the countries with the largest Muslim populations are not on the list.
Yeah.
Such as India and Indonesia.
And so the countries that are on the list are Iran and Iraq, Syria, Somalia, Yemen, Libya, and Sudan. Now, one of the interesting things about this is that every single one of these countries has at least some territory where homosexuality is punished by execution, by death. And if you look at the list, there are, depending on how you count, there are about 10 to 13 countries where this is true, and this is the majority of those countries. So what you are looking at is the places where the bad guys, the ones that are most counter to Western values, and I think we would agree that that's kind of a test. If you find out somebody's gay and you throw them off a building, that's pretty much counter to the values.
It strikes me as somewhat harsh in the circumstances.
Yes. And that's a test, and of course it goes along with such things as forcing women to cover themselves almost completely, and otherwise subjugating women, not letting them drive cars, not letting them work in offices, and not counting their testimony as a witness the way that you would count a man's testimony, basically allowing them to be raped because it's so difficult to get a rape conviction, and often the person who's the victim is the one who ends up being punished, and of course there's the sexual mutilation of women, which is widespread in the world, particularly in Muslim-dominated countries. And so these are the kind of things that you tie them all together. But I think the death penalty for homosexuality is sort of a good metric, a good way of measuring how bad these countries are. And so you see, as I say, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Somalia, Yemen, Libya, and Sudan, either the whole country or the part of the country that's dominated, say, by ISIS, is where they have this because they have Sharia law. Sharia law is the theocratic version of Islam, where no freedom of religion is allowed, no freedom of speech if you speak against the prevailing government. And again, this is totally, totally against everything we stand for as a country. And this is who's getting into the country in some cases. This is who the Trump administration is trying to figure out a way to keep them out. They don't care.
Well, President Trump has proposed an ideological certification on immigration forms, and that makes a lot of sense. Just as during the Cold War, when you applied to immigrate to the U.S., for example, you had to swear under penalty of perjury that you were not an adherent of the doctrines of world communism. I remember reading that phrase on some documents when I was sneaking across the border as a KGB agent.
I always thought that about you. something fishy going on there. But this is the kind of thing where you see the left, you see the true hypocrisy, because they have a women's rights march, and of course one of the four people who put that together is Linda Sarsour, who is an extremist, who's a supporter of the Palestinians. How do women do under Palestinian rule, and who is in fact worse than that. She
I think it's fair to call her an Islamo-fascist.
That's correct. And in fact, we dug up a tweet that she sent out, what was this, 2011, where she said of Bridget Gabriel, who's a Christian from Lebanon, a critic of Islam, who survived a bomb attack during the Civil War in Lebanon, and then Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who's someone who fled from oppression, became a parliamentarian in Europe, and is an activist. She's someone who
she's a Somali who was genital mutilation was forced upon her.
That's correct, and this is something that she openly discusses. And so here is the tweet that Linda Sarsour sent out about these women: Bridget Gabriel, Ayaan Hirsi Ali. There's like an equal sign between their names, and then it says she's asking for a ASS whipping. I wish I could take their vaginas away. They don't deserve to be women. Now, that would be bad enough under normal circumstances, but when we're talking about it in the context of female genital mutilation, that's creepy. And this was who was one of the main organizers of the Women's March last week. And then, of course, this week, just as last week, as I'm walking between the office and my apartment here in Washington, D.C., I run into the protesters, and they're either walking toward the protest or away from the protest, carrying their signs. And I asked one of the protesters I said, hey, I see you guys you obviously are protesting something, and I see some folks down the street with signs, but what is it you're protesting? I just wanted to know what he said. And he said, we're protesting the Muslim ban. Which, of course, as we said, this is not a Muslim ban.
Yeah, which Muslim ban is that?
Yeah, and so the left, of course, one of the things they do is they call it a Muslim ban, and then they say, oh, we're being hurt around the world because President Trump has put in this Muslim ban. Well, he didn't put in a Muslim ban, but we may be, in fact, hurt around the world, in the Islamic world.
And by the way, just a little footnote here, a Muslim ban in terms of who comes into the country is totally legal and constitutional.
Right.
We're not taking a position on it one way or the other, but the president has the power to do it.
Right. The First Amendment
unilaterally.
First Amendment only applies to people who are either American citizens or on American soil, and the president has the plenary power to keep anybody out of the country.
A sovereign nation gets to decide whom it wishes to admit.
Exactly, and that's an absolute legal right. It's kind of like the presidential pardon power. There is essentially no limit on it. And
I just wanted to bring that out because a lot of people don't seem to understand that.
Right, and now I wouldn't be in favor of a Muslim ban. I'm just saying that.
Oh, I would, but okay.
Well, the legal basis is there for the president to do such a thing, but he didn't do that. And so you have the left accusing him of doing it and then blaming him for the fact that people in other countries will think that he did when they were the ones who made people think that he did.
It's a really interesting way of setting up a straw man, isn't it?
Yeah, and that the left would switch in 1 week from this rally that supposedly is for women's rights and then switch over to now we're going to protest this ban, this temporary ban, that affects these countries. Now, it does affect refugees. I get that. But the thing is, we don't know, this idea that we can easily vet these refugees, you see news stories about the process they go through. We don't have records on these people.
And besides, refugees do not have a right to enter the United States.
Right.
The United States is entitled under the United Nations Convention relating to the status of refugees to judge them, to adjudicate their claims. No one enters the U.S. by right as a refugee. They seek refugee status. They seek asylum.
Right. But I have great sympathy for refugees. I support the idea of finding sanctuaries for them closer to their home territories. There are a lot of wealthy countries in the Middle East.
Yeah, like you can't escape from Iran and then show up in Greece and then come to America. You should have claimed refugee status in Greece.
Right.
That's the way it's supposed to
work.
work.
And of course, the number of refugees now is at the highest point in my lifetime, and that's largely because of Syria and other countries in the Middle East that were turned into that were set on fire by the policies of the Obama administration
And Hillary Clinton in particular.
Clinton. So encouraging the revolution in Syria, which was probably going to end badly, but could have succeeded if they had come in early, and could have succeeded perhaps with people who were pro-democracy and at least to some degree pro-Western values. But that was put aside. They didn't do anything to help at the key moments, and then the revolution ended up being taken over by bad guys.
Dr. Allen, why don't we keep the focus on what's going on here in America? What do you think about, and this hasn't been explored by a lot of people, the chattering classes yet. Moving the social justice battleground to America's airports. They're doing these massive protests at airports. This is a new thing. Like, I know there have always been First Amendment battles over airports, like Hare Krishna missionaries and Scientologists and whatever, wanting to hand out their literature, and case law and various statutes, have been enacted around the country governing, what can be done and what can't be done. But the idea of a mass demonstration where you overwhelm, it's a flash mob at an airport in order to protest a federal policy, this is something new in the American experience as I see it.
Right, and only 109 people, it said, were inconvenienced by the effect of the president's order this past weekend.
And somebody would have been inconvenienced no matter when Trump did it. So
right.
there was no gentle, perfect way of doing it.
And they couldn't announce it ahead of time, because the whole point is that the bad guys could try to sneak in under the deadline if you did that. But the thing is, if it's 109 people who were inconvenienced, how many people were inconvenienced?
Not that many.
But how many people were inconvenienced by the protests? And
what about the 3,000 people who were inconvenienced on 9/11 who were vaporized in the World Trade Towers and in the Pentagon and on a farmer's field in Pennsylvania?
Well, the thing is, the left's idea is to cause disruption, to cause people pain. They've been doing this forever. They used to shut down one of the bridges coming into Washington, D.C. During the so-called Justice for Janitors campaign. And that was not actually, by the way, about helping janitors. I've always been for helping janitors.
That was SEIU, Jobs for Justice,
That was
it?
the SEIU, which then took over the AFL-CIO and turned it into a left-wing machine.
Jobs with Justice.
Jobs with Justice. And so this is a common thing. And we're seeing this, of course, now with what's happening on the college campuses, with protests against Milo Yiannopoulos. That
was an excellent segue, Dr. Allen. Well done.
Here's a guy who is a homophobe. He's a racist. He's anti-Semitic, despite the fact that he was, he has a partially Jewish heritage. I believe his mother was Jewish. That he is.
Well, then he's Jewish, according to
the
people who decide these things.
Exactly, and that he, of course, is a gay man who, as he points out, how did he?
And he is not a closeted gay man. He talks about his gayness all the time.
Right, and I was actually at the event that he had during the Republican convention, and slightly off campus there, and he had it with Pamela Geller, who's a famous activist against the abuses committed by many in the Muslim world, and here he was talking about it. This was 20 minutes. He gave a speech endorsing Donald Trump. It was 20 minutes after he had been cut off of Twitter, after he had been banned from Twitter. And the story that they put out was that this was because he had insulted the actress Leslie Jones, who is on Saturday Night Live.
And that he'd encouraged a harassment campaign against her.
Well, yes. And that
I don't think he did. He just was criticizing her, and some people started sending her nasty tweets. And this is the risk you run when you're on Twitter.
And that's my point. They've never presented any evidence that he had anything to do with the terrible comments that some people did make. There were some racist comments, apparently. And she's very talented. a fan of hers on Saturday Night Live. The Ghostbusters movie was about as bad as Milo had said it was. But nevertheless, this was the excuse. And of course, they knocked him off of Twitter 20 minutes before he was scheduled to endorse Donald Trump for president. Now, I'm not saying that there's a connection there. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I got to tell you, that looked pretty bad. And so now you have this guy, he tries to speak at college campuses, and they burn the place down.
That's right. He showed up, I guess it was Wednesday, and he was supposed to speak Wednesday night at University of California at Berkeley. And he was there. There were reports that it was an event sponsored by the Berkeley College Republicans. That may be true. It might have been sponsored by multiple groups, but it was primarily our friends at the David Horowitz Freedom Center in Los Angeles who sponsored his speech, and he was there to launch their No Sanctuary Campus for Criminals campaign. The idea is that the University of California system harbors illegal aliens. In fact, former Homeland Security Secretary Janet Napolitano is the UC president, UC system president, and she's devoted $5 million to helping illegal aliens stay there illegally. UC actually has something called the University of California Undocumented Legal Services Center that's located at the UC Davis School of Law. So the idea that this poison, the sanctuary cities concept, is spreading to university campuses, which are defiantly saying people here are not subject to the laws of the land, are not subject to federal immigration laws, is a particularly noxious and offensive idea. And he was there to give his side of the story and demand that it be ended. And it had a little bit of a harder edge, too. The Freedom Center was demanding that Janet Napolitano and the Berkeley chancellor actually be prosecuted for interfering with the enforcement of the federal immigration law. But he didn't even get a chance to give a speech because there were left-wing protesters, students, and then they were joined apparently by, some people said, 150 outsiders dressed in black bloc attire. And this is typical for anarchists and communists. They were part of a group reportedly called Antifa, which is just a short form for anti-fascist, and they've been showing up and busting heads, literally, like hitting people with shovels and firing fireworks at them, and pepper spraying, macing Trump supporters in the face, stirring all sorts of trouble. So I'm not sure who caused the fires and started smashing all the windows and looting the Starbucks. Isn't that ironic? Starbucks is such a horrible left-wing company, and yet they always love attacking it. It's always Operation Latte Thunder, isn't it? from the Fight Club movie. So I'm not wishing this upon Starbucks, but I'm just saying, isn't it ironic that they always go after them? But anyway, these basically these terrorists, these rioters, prevented Milo Yiannopoulos from speaking, and in the process gave him potentially tens of millions of dollars of free publicity because he went on Tucker Carlson Live at 9 o'clock on Wednesday night and was interviewed from the scene after he'd safely been evacuated from the campus. And then he was on for, I think it was 10 or 15 minutes, which is a lot of time, prime time on Fox News Channel. He was on Tucker Carlson's show Thursday night, saying what happened and promoting his book that's coming out. So, if these little fascists at Berkeley think that they have shut down Milo Yiannopoulos, they are sorely mistaken. They have just made him into a civil rights hero.
Yeah, he is someone who, according to the...
And that's an amazing feat considering the controversial things that he says.
Yeah, he was described in a CNN tweet as an extremist who rallies white supremacists, he was in a New York Times headline as someone who he is someone who tries to give a speech and Trump tweets outrage, and they didn't even mention the violence in the New York Times headline.
Oh, no, that wasn't violence. That was just social justice.
Right, and Bloomberg, Milo Yiannopoulos sparks riots, that he's the one who's sparking the riots. I actually saw some video of a woman who was wearing a red hat in the style of the Trump hat. It actually, instead of saying "Make America Great Again," it said "Make Bitcoin Great Again." So it was a play on that, but she was apparently a Trump supporter, and she's being interviewed by the reporter on television, and someone comes up and pepper sprays her right in the face.
This is like, "Hey, you," trying to get her attention, and then sprays her.
Yeah. And and again, this is,
and she wasn't the only one. Many people were maced in the face by the so-called protesters at Berkeley the other night.
I loved his response, which he gave at the event that I attended there during the Republican convention, where he said that they had accused him of being a racist, and that he stopped. I'm going to clean it up for our family audience. He stopped committing a sex act with his boyfriend, who was African American, I suppose, or maybe just of African descent, and said, "Hey, guess what? I'm a racist. Did you know that?" So this is just the most absurd thing. They target people. They throw these terms out there. They're doing in the Supreme Court fight. They have no evidence. They simply say racist, sexist, homophobe, and they think that it's going to stick.
And I do want to get on to something else before we wrap up. The Frank Luntz is a messaging guru. He's pretty conservative most of the time, and he's a pollster. And he has gotten, at a recent GOP lawmakers retreat in Philadelphia, he managed to convince the GOP leaders on Capitol Hill that they should promise to repair Obamacare instead of repeal it or repeal and replace it. That it needs to don't end it, mend it, to borrow Bill Clinton's phrase about discussing affirmative action a few years back. This strikes me as incredibly tone deaf, and it would be a road to ruin for the Republicans, in my view. They have spent the last 7 years crusading against Obamacare. At first, they said, well, we need to get the House back in order to repeal Obamacare. They got the House back. Then they said, oh, we need to get the Senate back. They got the Senate back. Oh, we need to have the presidency in order to do this. Okay, Republicans have the presidency now. Why haven't they done it yet? Maybe they're going to, maybe they're not, but they seem to certainly be taking their time. This cannot be a good sign that they have agreed to go with this repair language instead of repeal. Am I right, Dr. Allen, or am I right?
Well, I think that...
And how right am I?
Frank Luntz is actually a very talented guy. I've known him for many years, going back to, I guess the Ross Perot insurgency. And then he helped out the Republicans in their effort to win control of Congress for the first time in 40 years, which happened in 1994 under Newt Gingrich. And he's, as I say, he's talented. He understands a lot about how words work. He does a lot of focus
groups. He even has a book called Words That Work.
Exactly. And he's sort of a guru on that. A lot of us study him to figure out how to express ourselves. But he's a creature of Washington to a great degree. And when you live here in this town, you want to get along with people. You want to be popular. And that tends to affect your thinking. And so he will, he's this guy who wants to have peace with the other side. And that's an element of what we call rhinoism, the Republican in name only.
This is cowardice in the face of the enemy, to use a military expression.
Well, I'll often say that a rhino is not someone who is a moderate necessarily. Rudy Giuliani is a moderate, but he is not a rhino. On the other hand, John Boehner, the former
he's not
speaker,
a rhino because he's willing to fight.
Because he's willing to fight. John Boehner, who was Speaker of the House, was a solid conservative on the issues, but he was a rhino because he wouldn't fight. And that's the difference. Is it someone who will fight? Is it someone who accepts the premises of the other side and says, oh, well, we must get along, we must compromise? And that's not how it works. That's not how you win. There are times to do that, certainly. But as we're seeing right now, sometimes you have to fight a revolution. And that means the people on the other side are going to understand that you're fighting a revolution, and they're going to go right back at you. And you
can't get rid of the crown jewel of the Obama legislative juggernaut without knocking some heads together, metaphorically.
Oh, absolutely.
Figuratively.
And remember, this thing was set with all kinds of landmines, where if you remove this part, then the whole thing causes negative consequences. And that's the kind of thing that we have to be aware of, and we have to get rid of it and do it just with like a Gordian knot. You just have to move quickly, and in an instant you have to do it. And that's what the Republicans need to be doing, or else they're going to lose on this issue.
And whether they do it or not is an open question at this point.
Yeah. Well, that's our show for this week. We'll see you again next week. And the week after that, we hope you'll join us. Please follow us at the Capitol Research Center on Facebook, on our YouTube channel, and at Capitol Research on Twitter. I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen.
And I'm Matthew Vadum, Senior Vice President here at Capitol Research Center, Editor-in-Chief of Bomb Throwers.
Thanks for listening.